Greetings and welcome back to Another Perspectives. We're going to be covering the United States yet again, but the United States is a big country, and so there are many different perspectives, as it were. I'm here today with a friend of mine, Adam Jensen. Yes, the Adam Jensen. Not only is he heavily augmented, he has an amazing hairdo. And we're going to be talking about the Midwest and religion and religiosity in the United States, guns, and pretty much anything else Adam Jensen wants to talk about. So let's start with the topic of the Midwest. The Midwest is a bit inscrutable to a lot of people, to myself as well. I've only been there a few times, very briefly, and I really have no connection to it whatsoever. So, Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Midwest and what kind of conditioner you use for your hair?
Certainly, Stardust. Thank you for having me on. So the Midwest is an interesting part of the United States in the sense that it's one that's very poorly defined. Generally, when people think of the Midwest, they think of states like North, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, etc. But the thing is, when you poll those people within those states, you get varying responses of whether or not they actually are a Midwesterner. But generally, it's a safe bet to say that most of those states are Midwestern. So the interesting thing about the Midwest is in multiple forms. One of the first things about the Midwest that makes it unique is that, as opposed to the coasts, most of the population tends to be in cities or towns that are less than 150,000 people. We do have a handful of major cities, such as Chicago and Detroit, but the vast majority of the population is very horizontally spread out. And that kind of leads to my second point, and that is, in my experience, when it comes to Midwesterners seem to have something along the lines of having two minds. They have this personality, this sort of view of themselves that they wish to be seen as intellectuals, somewhat in opposition to the South, but they don't want to be seen as somewhat elitist as the coastal parts of the United States can be seen as. And so what you get from that is you get a large number of very well-funded public universities and private universities, such as University of Wisconsin-Madison, Northwestern University, University of Michigan, and Washington University in St. Louis. But at the same time, you get this interesting contrast of high religiosity. The religiosity is something that I've personally experienced pretty much wherever I've gone throughout the Midwest.
Would you mind telling us what state you're from?
I'm originally from the state of Michigan. Michigan is a state that, again, very two-minded. I'd say roughly the left half of it, to make a broad distinction, is the conservative side, and the right half of it is more of the liberal side.
And one of 4 states in the United States, or only 4 in total, including Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Alaska, to have a native wolf population.
Yes, that much is true. Although, to be honest, I haven't seen one myself.
Yeah, they're way up there on the
Upper Peninsula.
That chunk of Michigan that's connected to Wisconsin. So
Yes, very resource rich, but very low in population. So the interesting thing about Michigan, as well as the Midwest, is this conflict of intellectual versus religious conservatism. And so, in my experience, creationism and intelligent design have been forces that have seen strong support, at least in the past, in my earlier years. So, growing up in Michigan, we actually experienced several people discussing intelligent design within churches and within public speaking areas. And these people would be people with PhDs in, say, chemistry from major universities, such as the University of Michigan. And they would give us talks about how evolution is a lie, and that the reason that the Bible and Christianity is the right answer is because if you look at a science textbook from 5 years ago, it's different from today, as opposed to the Bible being true and not unchanging. And so the Midwest kind of maintained this culture for a large portion of time. And it's also part of the reason why the atheist movement kind of cropped up also in these areas, because you have this second-mindedness, the intellectual aspect. And so you would see this infighting within the Midwest between these two ideas. And it still manifests itself to this day, despite the fact that creationism and intelligent design are essentially ideas that are no longer discussed.
Yeah. If I may, I think you can, I mean, basically any ancient text or old text that hasn't seen the light of day in centuries, if not millennia, doesn't change. The poem Beowulf, which is well over 1,000 years, hasn't changed either. It's not a particularly good argument.
No, it's a terrible argument. And as a scientist myself, it just completely disregards the intentions of science. Science is always looking for new answers and trying to revise itself. It's just a method of becoming less wrong about our knowledge.
Yeah, and I think this is a misconception, and it comes mostly from religious people that, in some sense, I can understand the religious perspective, because what they're actually looking for in a very sort of religious way is a kind of an absolutist epistemological framework for the world that doesn't need to be obviously revised because it's absolute. And obviously it taps into the need for permanence and some people's need for permanence. But would you mind talking a little bit about your own experiences? Because you used to be effectively a fundamentalist Christian.
Oh, more than effectively. I was a creationist up until about age 16.
I mean, I guess the first question that comes to mind is someone who grew up, although I'm not liberal myself, or left-wing, in quote-unquote liberal, super left-wing New York, where religiosity isn't a big thing. What is that like to have this notion of a specter in the background, the alleged figure of Jesus Christ, hovering over you at all times and sort of just invigilating against your every action? What's that like?
To describe it's somewhat terrifying at times, but also gives you a sense of moral superiority at other times. Essentially, whenever you're out in public, you get this sense of moral superiority. At least, perhaps that might be restricted in my case, but with my discussions with other Christians pre and post my religious state, it seems to be the case. When out in public, it really is, you really do see a sense of moral superiority. However, when you're in private, there's this constant fear. This constant fear of, am I doing what's right? Am I actually going to heaven? Am I going to hell? The fact that I see a girl and I'm 13, 14, 15, 16, and I'm having sexual thoughts about her, oh no, I have to pray to Jesus for forgiveness every single time I do that.
And hell and heaven are real things then in your mind.
Back then they were. They were terrifyingly real things. And to its credit, in some degrees, it did improve some aspects of my behavior. It did drive a sense of respect and of attempts at being a good person, if not for the wrong reasons. Essentially, I would be kinder, or I would be more charitable. I would be more helpful to those in need. Not that I'm not now, but it did help me as a younger person to try and be a good person. But in all actuality, it was purely selfish. It was because I was terrified of going to hell, and that was pretty well drilled into us when I was going to church. And the church that I went to wasn't atypical of the Midwest. I've visited many churches throughout the Midwest, And there wasn't anything particularly extreme about our church. It was just they were very heavy-handed. It's just the nature of the beast when it comes to Christianity. How it doesn't lead to things like the violence of Islam is something that I've kind of questioned myself about. I'm uncertain of. I think it mostly has to just do with the fact that Christianity has had several centuries to be dragged kicking and screaming to some degree of rationality. But at the same time, there is a lot of aspects of the Christian faith that are inherently violent.
Well, absolutely, if I might interject. Historically, I wouldn't say that the types of violence were identical, but you need only look at medieval Europe and really up into the early modern period to see that Christianity, in different ways, was every bit as violent as Islam. I mean, inquisitions, accusations of witchcraft. In fact, Thomas Aquinas endorses officially the torture of heretics because he got it from the Bible.
Yes.
I mean, and it's also safe to say if you were to actually compare the texts of, say, the Old Testament, like Leviticus and Exodus, with parts of the Quran, I mean, I actually think the Old Testament wins out.
Yeah.
It's just that most Christians, with a few exceptions, don't take it all that seriously anymore. But if they did, that would be a pretty scary precedent. And they used to, obviously, back in the day.
Yes,
so,
certainly. The thing is, what I've noticed now is that how Christians have channeled that inherent violent nature of their religion is into politics. Basically, take Israel, for example. There is a lot of financial and political backing of Israeli and Middle Eastern interference because the motivation of a lot of Christians is it is believed that this will bring about the end times. And when you look into Revelation, the end times they're not nice. They're expecting a massive world war involving every single major military on the planet. There's supposed to be some grand ruler who will unite all people, but who will actually be either an agent of the Antichrist or the Antichrist himself.
So you're saying that the so-called Christian Zionist agenda is actually a separate one from the Jewish Zionist agenda, because there's a kind of cynicism behind it, because they actually want to see some sort of conflict between Israel and the Arab players in the Middle East.
Yes, exactly. One of the key things that they're looking for is for essentially a type of crusade, in the sense that they want, for instance, the Dome of the Rock. It was believed to be Abraham's original living house. That is currently under Islamic control within the borders of Israel.
It's contested between Jews and all the usual religious bullshit.
And so a lot of the political endorsement of Israel through these evangelical Christians and from the Midwest is to essentially see that the prophecy of the Dome of the Rock being returned to the Jews happens, and that's one of the first steps to the rapture, essentially, according to these Christians.
Although it strikes me as something that, I mean, obviously Jewish Zionists would recognize that they probably think these people are just useful tools, ultimately.
Certainly.
In supporting the state of Israel, more than valuable allies.
Yes.
But I would be disinclined to believe you, but I've actually seen comments multiple times along those lines. X event happens in the Middle East, and how it somehow corresponds with some passage from the Book of Revelations, or something along those lines. So I've actually seen people write these things in a very believable manner, meaning they believe it. So that's very unfortunate, and in particular because of the famous self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, you don't need biblical prophecies to become true, especially given powder keg that
The Middle East is.
the Middle East is.
Yeah.
So I don't see this as being helpful. In fact, I mean, I know we're going off on a tangent, but I would just like, as far as American foreign policy is concerned, and European too, to go back to a non-interventionist state of mind where we're not actively getting involved in a million different conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, whether it be for Israel's sake or Saudi Arabia or Palestine, just because I honestly, barring world-ending apocalyptic events,
Right.
I don't really think that apart from the oil connection to Saudi and some other places, that there are real genuine Western interests. And I'm speaking from a position of, say, realpolitik, this sort of hardline politics.
Mm-hmm.
I know you and I share similar politics, and ideally we would have, an anarcho-capitalist state or minarchist, but as the status quo happens to be, that the Middle East really doesn't need to have all the Western fingers involved in it. And I don't think these Zionist Christians are being particularly helpful there. Now, moving away, because this is a bit off topic,
Mm-hmm.
when you were growing up and you heard about this, weird thing about evolution and what have you, did that strike you as weird? I mean, or was it the usual? I've had encounters with particularly Midwestern, like, I ain't evolved from no monkey or something like that. I mean, was that the approach?
It was a little bit more towards the latter, but somewhat more sophisticated.
Right.
My pastors, my I don't know what you would call them, my
co-religionists?
Co-religionists, yes, that's a good word, would essentially try and couch arguments against evolution from a scientific perspective when they could, or what their bastardized version of a scientific method. But they would also just essentially beat into the fact that, hey, if you're a Christian, you can't believe this stuff. It's lies from the devil. Take Answers in Genesis. It's this it used to be a very famous source for a lot of pastors and a lot of people fighting for intelligent design. It takes both we're going to use faulty, quote-unquote, scientific arguments to prove that, for instance, the Grand Valley couldn't be formed over a millennia. It was just formed by the Noah's flood, or that the reason why, for instance, we have fossils in different strata is actually because, and I'm not making this up, it's because they floated due to their body weight, or because the smarter animals just climbed higher and the dumb animals...
Actually, Adam, I know another argument I've heard which goes, it's God testing humans, God testing people. So
yes, testing your faith.
Right. So basically placing fossils in different areas will, I mean, if you believe it, then you've fallen for the devil's influence or something like that.
Well, and there's this other conflict, this cognitive dissonance that I had as a Christian and that many Christians hold to this day, which is, well, God is in control of everything, which means God created the planet the way that it is. God, therefore, placed those fossils there. And so, if anything, it wasn't the devil trying to trick you. It was God trying to, quote unquote, test your faith. And so you have to constantly debate with yourself as a Christian. Well, okay, did the devil do this? Did God do this? Well, God is in control of everything, but there's still bad things that happen. So, well, God gives us free will, but at the same time, God already knows what's going to happen because He's all-knowing. He's omnipresent, omnipotent, and it was a difficult thing to hold on to.
It strikes me, a lot of the, I guess, modern Christian tribulations with evolution strike me as very similar to things that had happened in the early 20th century and the late 19th after Darwin published The Descent of Man, because they too at the time struggled with this idea of sort of being elected, humans being special. After all, the message of the mythical figure Jesus, who happened to appear in this desert shithole that we were just talking about, randomly there, not in Australia or China or Greenland, but there, was that, I'm special and you're special if you believe in me. And I think this has been sort of human exceptionalism. I mean, there are all kinds of human exceptionalisms, but human religious exceptionalism has always been one of the biggest obstacles to evolution. It's the same, as far as I know, in the Islamic world. They don't teach evolution either. And this just seems to be a recurrent theme. And as long as people want to feel special, and as you know, in a MGTOW context, a lot of people don't like finding out about the reality between the sexes,
right,
or anything else for that matter. Ethnic, racial distinctions, all the stuff you would consider sort of red pill, takes away from that notion of exceptionalism. So I guess I look at it from an outside perspective, not having a religious bone in my body and never having had one, that it's kind of the death throes. It's a last effort to sort of combat what is just overwhelming evidence in favor of the fact that we evolved through evolution by natural selection.
Yes, it will take a long time, though, because when it really comes down to it, the fear of death is something that is very hard to combat. And that's, in reality, probably one of the largest motivators for these people still clinging to their faith.
If I might, I've read a lot of, there are people who actually, I would agree with you to a degree, but I've read some interesting sociological theses that go along the lines of the reality behind American religiosity, particularly Midwestern religiosity, is the need for social cohesion above all. As you pointed out, there aren't as many conurbations in the Midwest as, say, on the coast, where you see the big states in California, big cities in California and New York and Atlanta and so on and so forth. So to make up for that lack of conurbanity, people sort of form these closely knit units that end up being church, and that was I find that somewhat plausible as well. The need to just have a social interaction. Meet every Sunday and sort of reinforces that. And of course, there's the religious aspect as well. But because the United States, particularly the Midwest, is so spread out, it's an argument I've heard. Also, one of the reasons why it seems that one thing that you do notice, and which would support this thesis, is that the most urban areas, typically speaking, certainly in Europe, but also in the United States, tend to be, on average, a lot less religious.
Right.
So places like New York City, L.A., Chicago, and of course Chicago's in the Midwest, but I would reckon that Chicago is probably less religious than, say, Topeka, Kansas or something.
Absolutely.
So I think there's something to both of those things. I think it's the need to form sort of social units and get along with people and feel connected, as well as the need for quote-unquote meaning in a universe that doesn't offer a lot of quote-unquote objective meaning.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. That absolutely makes sense.
How did you escape the trap of fundamentalist Christianity, and how did you eventually become an atheist and a devotee of science and evolution?
Well, copy of Atlas Shrugged, ironically.
Mystics of muscle, mystics of spirit.
I mean, it was the worst book to give to a Christian 16-year-old. It is literally the gateway drug out.
You are effectively a mystic of spirit.
Essentially.
By the lights of John Gall.
Yes. I'm quite happy, not to offend any, or the two objectivists that might be listening, not to offend both of you, but I'm sure I'm happy that I've gotten through that phase. It was a useful tool.
I was there too, at approximately the same age. It was somewhere between about 16 and 19. I was a huge aficionado of Randian philosophy, and I used to obsessively re-listen to the John Galt speech. I had this. There's this. At the time, I thought he was brilliant. Voice actor, orator, who was just repeating it, and I mean, there's some kernels of truth to it. Some in other parts, it tends to be pretty off base. But for me, it was much less a sort of retreat from religion, because I had never felt a religious bone in my body. But it was just sort of. I think not to get on a tangent, but I do think the objectivist philosophy, it's not a religion, but it strives at least to be all-encompassing and thus to offer the same answers.
Yeah.
As it lacks nuance, basically. But getting back to the point, I could see how John Galt might have freed you from the burden of being a mystic of spirit.
Well, the thing was, being raised as a creationist, on the flip side, there was a benefit in the sense that I was also raised fiscally conservative. And that is something that has heavily benefited me. I have a very strong, I mean, I don't want to lack humility, but I derived a strong work ethic from it. Derived a good sense of handling my money. I tend to be cheap, is a good way of putting that.
Amazing hair.
And yes, that's all those benefits. So the thing was, it was something along the lines of, yes, I was an evangelical Christian who believed in creationism, but I was also conservative leaning. And so naturally, Atlas Shrugged was a heavily conservative leaning book. And so it kind of clicked for me at the beginning, because at the beginning it's just like, oh yeah, the government's bad, taxes and regulations are bad, blah, blah, blah. And then it was just like, oh, well, hey, if you believe in this rational discourse, and as someone who was heavily interested in science, yet still an evolution denier, it kind of stuck with me. It was just like, well, if you're going to be a rational person, and you're going to be rational in this regard, you have to be rational in that regard. And that clicked with me. And so it just made it made life make more sense. It made biology make sense. To quote the person whose name I'm forgetting, nothing makes sense in biology outside of the light of evolution.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name as well, but I would agree with that. Although clearly there are people who, particularly doctors. I mean, I've looked at stats here, and then I don't have them in front of me, but I recall that there are more doctors who don't believe in evolution versus actual scientists. So if you only just focus on the anatomical and whatever sort of rote learning or goes on in medical school, then you can kind of avoid that. Yeah. But it is difficult.
That is the exact reason. It is because of the nature of medical training being essentially just 4 to some amount of years, 4 to 5 years of just rote memorization, and then just here's problem, fix problem. Not to undermine the work of medical doctors. They do incredible work, and they're incredibly intelligent. It's just that they have the way of education very strongly enforces compartmentalization, and allows for people like Ben Carson to be an amazing neurosurgeon, and yet still believe in Seventh-day Adventism or whatever.
Yeah, he seems to me a prototypical example of this, actually.
Exactly. It's certainly a trend that is very widespread in the Midwest. And so hopefully we'll see that decline. I mean, we're already seeing a decline in church attendance and people reporting themselves as religious within the United States, and including the Midwest. So eventually that'll die down. And hopefully soon, because evolution-based medicine is something that needs to be more heavily implemented.
Well, if anything, I think, and I've made this argument often in my videos, that I mean, yes, there's a public school curriculum, and that's a separate issue in general, but I don't recall really being explicitly taught evolution in school, and I think in general there's far too little far too little emphasis on it. So,
Yeah.
Everyone studies biology in school, but nobody talks about evolution in that context. In fact, I would argue that it's probably better to spend a year or two studying evolution by natural selection, and then actually start to talk about cells and mitochondria, because it only makes sense in that context, rather than just sort of this, here's some cells, here's some mitochondria, here's some proteins, amino acids, blah, blah, blah.
It doesn't rote memorization.
Yeah, and I think it would be immensely helpful and probably would make the subject more interesting. I mean, I remember in high school not being terribly interested in biology, even though it's probably the branch of science interesting the most.
Mm-hmm.
That's because, they just said, memorize this shit, and we'll test you on it, and that's it. So
yeah, exactly.
That's pretty much it.
And that probably partially explains why the United States underperforms academically versus the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, among other things.
Among a lot of other things, of course.
Yeah, but the United States has the least emphasis. I mean, it's part of the religious mandate, I suppose. Although that seems to change at university. I mean, you obviously can't really operate at a university level as a scientist and deny evolution.
Yeah,
especially if you're somehow involved with biology.
Yeah, there's no safe spaces in the STEM fields for those sorts of ideas. You can't last long if you deny basic tenets, unless you're in some field like chemistry or maybe physics.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the stats and polls, the more a scientist is involved in the biological sciences, the more likely he is to be irreligious. And it's actually physicists who have the highest rates of religiosity, and I think it's because they're far removed from all the blood and the goo and all that other stuff.
Yes.
And they're just looking at abstraction. Now, so you sort of saved yourself, or Ayn Rand helped you to move away from that trap.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you did that, when you finally moved out of that, was it painful? Was it gradual? Was it instant? Did you just feel relief? Did you feel a mixture of negative and positive? What was it like?
From a mental perspective, instant relief. With my personality, I have this sort of on-off kind of system of thinking. It explains why I was a creationist. It's, if you believe in the Bible, you believe in it all the way, or else you're contradicting yourself. And so, essentially, by getting into Ayn Rand and doing away with creationism, that solved a whole bunch of mental contradictions for me. So it was a large mental relief. But there's a downside to that. The rest of my family, and I have a relatively large family, to this day are still very, very religious evangelical Christians. And most of the people around me, up until I started working, were very religious, and so I felt very out of place. And that's just the nature of living in the Midwest. It's a religious part of the United States, but it still fosters that intellectual vigor. And so I was able to go to a well-funded public university that had excellent education. And
what did you study?
I studied neuroscience for my bachelor's.
No spoilers, guys, but he's going to be telling us a lot more about neurology and other things in the future. Anyway, please.
Oh, of course. And so, heavily enjoyed learning about neuroscience. And so, that's the thing. Winding back to this two-mindedness of the Midwest, you have these religious elements, but at the same time, you have these higher institutions of learning that are very high quality. Northwestern University, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Washington University in St. Louis. The Midwest basically wants to at least from my perspective, wants to appear like the intelligent elites of Boston and New York City, but they still have this sort of repressed fear of being seen as elites, and that's where the religiosity comes in. And
so, on the ground level, beyond the religiosity, I mean, you've visited my hometown. You've been to the East Coast. I mean, beyond the religious stuff, what do you think? Is there a difference in mentality and attitude? Are people friendlier, less approachable? I don't really know. I mean, having only been to the Midwest a few times, what difference do you notice, would you say?
One of the things that I would notice is that in the Midwest, it can vary state by state, but generally people are a little bit more welcoming. Not by a huge margin, but people are generally a little bit more approachable, open. Just, you could talk to a stranger very easily in the Midwest and have a nice conversation. In visiting, say, New York City and Boston and let's see, where else? Philadelphia. Philadelphia, people are still somewhat approachable, but for like cities like Boston and New York, it's a little less so. It's not significant, but it's noticeable. That's really one of the main differences that I notice. And of course, the other major difference is the focus on guns.
Right. Would you like to? I know you love your guns, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I was just waiting for that. So Midwest, probably. Second to the South, and maybe the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, I think second to the South only. The Midwest, very strong pro-gun stance. Pretty much every state in the Midwest, outside of Illinois' Chicago,
a.k.a. Chirac.
Chirac, yes. And even they were forced to start allowing this. Concealed carry of firearms is pretty much ubiquitous across the Midwest. It's very normal to see people in Walmart parking lots exchanging money or ammunition for firearms. Hunting is huge here, in Michigan especially, because Michigan has a very dense population of deer, and therefore we get a very high number of deer car fatalities from deer accidents. And so hunting is a very important aspect of the Midwest character. And so along with that develops a very strong sense of guns, gun rights, gun culture.
So Michigan is deer overpopulated, is that correct?
It has been for quite some time.
If I might go off on a tangent, this is what happens when you destroy an ecosystem, when you remove the natural predator, the wolf.
Yes.
Among other things, you get overpopulation. Scotland has the same problem. Please continue.
Oh, yes, of course. And so, with Michigan, outside of last year's winter, which kind of culled the deer population a bit, Michigan has essentially had a large deer problem for as long as I can remember. Deer would kill a lot of people, and so hunting is something that, even in a somewhat blue state or democratic state like Michigan, hunting is a very, very strong aspect of Michigan culture. Outside of that, the Midwest, in regards to deer, I'm not as well versed in population.
I can tell you, in New York State, I mean, people envision just New York City. It's a pretty big state. It's absolutely overpopulated by deer. And the largest predator is actually an omnivore, the black bear. We do have coyote, but they don't. I mean, so there's no actual natural predator of I believe it's white-tailed deer in New York. So their hunting's fairly popular there, at least in upstate as well. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but this is true of many states I've looked into, that when the two natural predators in North America, the puma or the cougar, and because the cougar used to be found throughout the United States pretty much, particularly more on the West Coast and East Coast, and certainly wolves were everywhere. When you got rid of them, I mean, that's what happened. Same thing happened in Scotland and so on and so forth. But regarding gun culture, so, I'm someone who did not grow up in a gun culture. I have, I think everyone knows my views. I'm not going to repeat myself, but when you go to a place like New York City or the East Coast, barring 3 states, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, it tends to be very sort of gun control heavy, very left leaning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you feel out of whack there?
If I ever bring up the topic, and it's not necessarily restricted to those states, say the universities in the Midwest as well, to a lesser extent, but still there. I generally get a mixed bag of reactions. In the coastal states, I'm generally seen as a quote-unquote gun nut just because I happen to own a pistol and I conceal carry. And
so if someone asks you, they say, Adam, why do you conceal carry when your entire body is a lethal weapon?
Well, it's there's a multitude of reasons. The first of those reasons I can base.
Aren't your augmentations enough, man?
Hey, it's not fair. It's not fair to them, and I didn't ask for this. Essentially, the thing is, when it comes to violence in the United States, we are at a point where violence is at a relatively historic low. I believe Coltane had just released a video discussing how violence is approaching the low levels that it was at in the 1950s. However, at the same time, violence is random. There was just a mass shooting in Michigan. And so the reason why I concealed carry, despite the fact that I have all these augments, is the thing is, looking at actual statistics of how people respond to a mugger, the lowest amounts of injury to the victim, the person being mugged, involves that person having a firearm. Next is a knife, and then above that is fisticuffs. And so it's just generally safer to have a gun on you because you don't have to pull the trigger in order to stop a mugging. And at the same time, it allows for training with something that is a tool that is heavily ingrained in American culture. Guns are an American icon.
Agreed.
And getting
you have a very specific. I mean, you acknowledge that it's an incredibly dangerous tool.
Absolutely.
You're very. I mean, you're perhaps even excessively cautious, right?
Absolutely. The thing is, if there's one thing that I could get everybody in the world to understand is, the gun is always loaded, especially when it's not. Guns are dangerous tools that can be useful, but they need to be respected. And the thing is, this is why I have some difficulties with the states that are populated by people who tend to see a gun and just think or just be terrified of it. That's dangerous. It's dangerous. You're basically making a population in a country where guns are a cultural icon. You're making a population that's not trained to safely deal with a tool that's so prevalent. I mean, there are more guns than people in the United States. And so the thing is, part of the reason why I got the concealed carry was so that I could go through safety training. I wanted to know how to effectively use a firearm, but also to know how to be safe with a firearm. Because it's just something, as an American, that we live with. Guns are essentially everywhere. And hell, even when I was a Christian and going to Jesus camp from ages 10 to 18, there was a riflery range. It's just something that you can't really escape unless you really hole yourself into some bubble like university for the entirety of your life. But even then,
or far left leaning state, and this has always been my argument. I mean, I naturally I feel uncomfortable with guns because I just don't have experience with them. But and for those of you who don't know, check out because I recommended this to Adam as well. There's a really good talk by Sam Harris, and a shooting instructor, actually, a former I think he's SWAT leader, police officer, basically saying the same thing, that 300 million firearms on the ground, you're not going to get rid of them. So might as well learn to deal with them. And if I were to live in the United States again, I probably would undergo firearm training. I can't imagine becoming as interested or obsessed as some people, but maybe I'd, learn how to fire a pistol or whatever. I certainly wouldn't be living in New York City again because I can't afford it, but I think there's some sound reasoning behind it. But I think it was you that showed me that list. What was it? It's like a gun control organization.
Yes, the Brady campaign for ending gun violence.
Right. That a few of the states, particularly I think it was Maine, that had terrible ratings, but also possibly the lowest gun violence rate in the country.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. With the question of gun control within the United States, it's a difficult thing to study. You can see high gun amounts in one area of the country and see high crime as a result, or as a potential result. But then you could also look at other states that have very few regulations on guns, very high number of guns, and an incredibly low number of gun crimes. And so it really does mark the fact that gun control and guns as a whole are issues that can't be universally addressed. It would be like trying to regulate some aspect of, say, European culture, something along the lines of, I'm not entirely well versed.
Well, I think it's more along the lines of guns are to the United States what Islam is to the Middle East. I mean, you're not going to turn the Middle East into a bunch of hardcore atheists.
Yeah, that's a good
It's not
point.
going to happen.
It's just best to learn either how to safely work with, say, both, or to learn how to avoid. If the thing is, like, with the United States, it really is just these goals of gun control are really just pie in the sky. And as Stardust had just mentioned, there's too many guns on the ground in the United States, and it's heavily ingrained in our culture. It's the Second Amendment. And it's not what Feinstein or Cuomo or whatever left-wing individual wants. It's just what the reality is guns are here, and they're here to stay. And I don't see a future, at least in my lifespan, I don't see a future where guns will effectively disappear. They're here to stay. And if anything, they're just going to get more and more technologically advanced.
Sam Harris has an interesting argument that, I mean, he's pro-gun as well, but it's he said that the moment there is a non-lethal alternative to guns is the moment guns can be replaced. Do you know? Well, you know because it's part of your augments, but the PEP gun, the PEP augmentation,
yes,
which is effectively disables your opponent, something along those lines.
A very advanced taser, essentially.
Basically, if you had a effective, 99% viability advanced taser, could you then accept the argument that that could replace a gun? Because ideally, depending on the situation, but in most situations, you probably wouldn't want to just lethally shoot somebody. You want to just completely take them out of the combat scenario. Because
eliminate the danger is usually...
Eliminate the danger, which can involve lethally shooting somebody, but not necessarily. And with something like the PEP gun or the PEP augmentation, you could basically get rid of the danger without actually killing the person.
That would be a very desirable alternative, but I don't see something like that coming in the near future. But let's imagine what would be necessary to make something like that happen. So in order for something like that to subsume or overtake firearms in the United States, it needs to be able to fire multiple rounds within a short period of time. It needs to be relatively easy to maintain, relatively cheap to feed via cartridges or whatnot, and it needs to be accurate. And so essentially what you'd be looking at is a pistol that just, instead of firing bullets, it would fire a taser bullet or some sort of inactivating agent. And so essentially it would look exactly the same. The problem is there's not really any technology that's like that. I mean, there's beanbag shotguns, there's rock salt.
Well, this is obviously why the PEP augmentation is more a science fiction thing than anything.
Exactly, and that therein lies the problem. But even if this alternative did exist, and it were at the same cost level, I don't see guns disappearing. They would still be used for. I mean, there's always hunting. I mean, you don't want to tase a deer. You want to kill a deer. And sometimes it actually is in your, like, for instance, the military wouldn't adopt this because.
No, obviously there are situations where lethality is preferable to just making someone inoperable, rendering them inoperable.
So that's the reason why I think that we'll never actually reach a state where a non-lethal alternative to a firearm would overtake the precedence of firearms, at least in the United States.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. I think guns are there to stay.
Pretty much.
Obviously. And, it's just kind of a moot point, the whole gun control thing. Even in discussions, cultural things have changed before, but, there's the sheer physical presence and the numbers. But they're going to just manually go up to everyone's home and confiscate the guns, and it's just not going to happen.
Yeah,
ever.
Especially seeing as trust in the United States government has plummeted from somewhere around 86% in the 50s down to 19% today.
Yeah, well,
that's from The Economist, by the way, if anybody wants to look that up. But go ahead.
No, I mean, there's no. I don't really trust the government. But I mean, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your political perspectives. I mean, since you are a hardcore anarcho-capitalist.
Well, I mean, essentially how it worked out was Ayn Rand was my gateway drug to libertarianism, and then libertarianism and the fact that I'd mentioned that I have a very strong dislike for contradictions essentially led me to minarchism and then anarchism. However, when people hear the word anarchy, they immediately think of Somalia.
No. Let me think. No, that's a bad argument. That's a pseudo argument that left-leaning people offer. Well, if you want an anarcho-capitalist state, head over to Somalia.
Yeah, and then the joke response is, if you like government so much, then you move to North Korea.
Yeah.
But there's for serious conversation, though. Really, my political ideals are for not necessarily a society without governments. I believe in governance. I just don't believe in the moral claims that states have made. For instance, it's quite clear that the people in Washington, D.C. didn't rightfully take the entirety of the United States in a peaceful and just manner. I mean, the Louisiana Purchase wasn't exactly agreed to by the people living in that territory.
No, I mean, objectively, there are always going to be elements of the state that are just forceful and violent.
Certainly. But the thing is, when pressed down to like what my ideal would be, is something similar to what the United States already has to offer. Basically, choose your own government. Choose your own set of laws, and that's what the United States offers.
And if the federal government respected the 10th Amendment more, this is my argument that I often make, there would be a lot more choice. There would be potentially radically different states, and I think you agree with this. So if you wanted to live in a heavily socialized 70% income tax state with the government taking care of the local or the state government taking care of everything, you could do that.
Yeah.
And we obviously wouldn't be living in that state, but
yes.
But I agree. I think one of the biggest problems is there's just too much federal government and too little 10th Amendment, because I think you would just see many radical shifts. You would see entire states decriminalizing drugs. And we've talked about this before, but obviously the federal government has a vested interest in continuing the drug war so they can keep their bureaucrats, the bureaucrats can stay in power and keep their paychecks going on. I think, to be fair, there are very few left-leaning people that actually believe strongly in the 10th Amendment. They might pay lip service to it.
Yeah.
But I think it's one of the most discounted amendments that could be so game-changing for the entire United States, because I would, if we really had an effective 10th Amendment, I would consider moving back to some state that would appeal to me, with zero income tax and no drug war and a lot less regulation on different things and
exactly
things of that nature. But I hate to say it, but as long as we have left-leaning people involved in the government, we're never going to get the 10th Amendment back in its entirety and in full force.
Well, there are a couple of methods that you could use to at least slow down the increasing pace of government largesse. Take, for instance, the New Hampshire project. There's a group of libertarians that have dedicated themselves to getting as many people who share their political opinions to move to New Hampshire. And as a result, you've seen a noticeable shift in policy towards more libertarian ways. They've had a more open system or a less restrictive system of gun control. They've had lowered taxes, less regulation, and they have a very low crime, low religiosity as well. Libertarians do tend to be atheist or non-religious. And so New Hampshire is essentially a good example of a quote-unquote ANCAP solution, where if you don't like the current government that you're under, you can just move to another one.
Unfortunately, though, as you know, the federal income tax is a relative novelty, and
yes,
I'm
not illegal, by the way.
And yes, and illegal. I'm not someone who reverences reveres the founding fathers like some sort of religious icon,
right?
But they certainly didn't envision a federal income tax, and so ideally, I guess I don't know if you agree with this, but the United States, if it actually were built around the principles that had gone into it originally, would be no federal income tax, and it would be up to the state's residents of whatever state they chose. So, socialists and left-leaning people could have like I said, their 70 or 80 or whatever % income tax and regulation on everything.
Yeah.
But there would be no federal income tax, and so people could just choose on the basis of that, ideally at least.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes down to it, to fully answer your question of my political leanings, it's really just as long as something's voluntary, I would be hard pressed not to support it. If you want to join a hippie commune where there is no money and everybody shares everything, as long as you're not forcing anybody to join it, I'm more than happy for you to join it. Just don't make me join it, because I like soap and I like not smelling like weed. Whereas things like Massachusetts versus, say, Texas or New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, it's if people want to pay more taxes, then I have no problem with them doing so. I just want people to have the choice.
And I think this is the big issue ultimately, and I sometimes get in discussions that end up being headaches with my friend Coltane, who is a bit of a statist, and I tend to try to avoid politics. It's just that me being more minarchist, you being more, we're closer than most people in that regard. We're the people that actually have the government state or state structure that least resembles what we ideally would like to live in, whereas everyone else, it's not exact, it's not ideal. I suppose people who are super socialists want everything, governmentalized, if you will, but I think we're the ones who get the least of what we want ultimately.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. We have the entire world has basically been on a non-stop trek towards larger and larger governments. Although at the same time, there have been expansions in trade, free trade, and that's something that I'm happy about. The fact that the entire world is becoming more wealthy, that is a good thing. The fact that it's easier and easier for people with certain sets of skills, be they low, high, medium, high education, low education, etc. More and more people can afford to move to places that more fit what they desire to do. And this is another arena where I think the United States has an advantage over Europe, especially Sweden and Norway. The fact that we have a relatively weak welfare system in comparison to Europe, a relatively low minimum wage, and our immigration system could certainly take some improvements. But there's a reason why when you see immigrants in the United States, they integrate. You take Dearborn, Michigan, for example. It's one of the highest concentrations of Arabic people, Iranians, Iraqis.
Iranians, incidentally, are not Arab, but
yes, my apologies. But Middle Eastern persons. Dearborn is highly populated by these immigrants, and compared to the national average, their violent crime is much lower. Compared to New York City, it's much lower. Compared to Boston, violent crime is much lower. And the thing is, when you have all these barriers of entry lowered, such as minimum wage, such as and the negative incentive, such as a strong welfare system, not present, then the immigrants that tend to come to the United States realize, well, I can't really be a welfare tourist and go to Norway, but I can get a job. And when people get jobs, it essentially forces them to integrate with the country that they're in, because when you're working in that country, you're working with your employer, and your employer is an American or is something along the lines. And that's the reason why there's this term called enclaving. And essentially what that is it's what you see in Sweden. Sweden has a very high minimum wage, very strong welfare system. very generous welfare system. And so immigrants will arrive in Sweden. Low-skill, low-education immigrants will arrive in Sweden. But because they're low-skill and low education, they've essentially had the bottom rungs of the ladder kicked out from them, so they cannot effectively contribute to society through labor unless they do so illegally.
Agreed. If I might interject, it's funny, and it's in the context of this, bringing up Sweden, that I recently watched a program where they made very clear that the anti-immigration people have said, we believe in the welfare state. All they are basically sort of nationalistic socialists. That's their position. They're not interested in reducing the size of government at all.
Yeah, they're Rawlsians essentially. And Rawls, the founder of social justice, was the first to say this. He essentially wanted a very strong welfare state, but also incredibly strong borders. So welfare for me, but not for thee. That sort of idea. And so this isn't new. So these quote unquote far right parties, as the media likes to portray them, are, as you say, just left wing politicians who just want strong immigration control. And so the thing is, though, neither of those parties addresses the issue at hand. And the issue at hand is these are low-income, low-education persons entering a country where there are incredibly high barriers to entry into the workforce. In the United States, illegal immigrants, such as Hispanics from Mexico, can very easily integrate into the United States because they can get a job. Because the minimum wage is low.
Adam, if I can, this is directly pertinent. I think we talked about this a day or so ago. Mm-hmm. So I was watching this Vice episode, a couple of years old, maybe it was in 2013, and they were basically documenting these residents, if you will, of Tijuana, Mexico, mm-hmm. which is in Baja California, I believe, and they had illegally immigrated, if you will, to the United States. Mm-hmm. They had found gainful employment. One was working as an auto mechanic, making a decent living. I almost felt bad for them because they didn't. I mean, their only crime is they didn't go through the official channels,
which is insane, by the way, in the United States.
Yeah. So they got caught for some insanely minor infraction, like a parking ticket or something like that, and they were sent packing, and their entire lives ended up in disaster and living in these sort of essentially underground bungalows that looked like shitholes. And they had good lives doing basically simple labor, auto mechanics, janitorial work. And I think if we had a freer society, then there would be a lot less resentment towards them, and everyone would benefit. I totally agree with you, but what Europe... The prize that people are after in Europe is the welfare checks, these welfare tourism, which I've talked about. But let's be honest, as long as particularly women are in the voting booth and have so much influence in the government, the welfare state is here to stay.
The welfare state is going to stick around in Europe until it becomes overburdened. And essentially this mass immigration by Merkel and others is just accelerating the decline of the welfare state in that part of the world. It's just not going to be able to handle it. The welfare state is inherently non-sustainable, especially in countries that are developed and wealthy, because of the fact of the increasing proportion of older people taking out of the system and the decreasing proportion of younger people paying into the system.
Well, particularly in light of what I would call the mechanization effect induced lack of reproduction, that people in technologically advanced societies, whether they're in Asia or Europe or whatever, just tend to have fewer children.
Exactly. And so in the long run, a strong welfare state is unsustainable. Where pretty much every major Western country runs a massive public deficit. And we can keep on kicking the can down the road with partial government shutdowns and bailouts and whatnot for countries such as Greece, but it's just unsustainable. And essentially what Merkel is doing with, say, these Syrian immigrants is just pouring petrol on the fire. It's not going to work. And the thing is, it's not an immigration problem. the United States clearly shows that. If you look at the studies behind Hispanic illegal immigrant contributions to tax revenue versus what they take out, multiple studies are either neutral in the sense that it's about even, or there's a slight positive effect on tax revenue because if you're an illegal immigrant, it's not as easy to file a tax return. And so you pay your income taxes because your employer takes them out of your paycheck automatically. But you're not a citizen, so you don't file for a tax return. Not nearly as often as citizens do. There are a large number of illegal immigrants who do file for tax returns, though.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm in complete agreement with you. It's just my only, I guess, me being significantly older and a bit of a pessimist, if you will. I just don't. I mean, sure, the welfare state's collapse will be accelerated by what's going on in Europe. Although, to be selfishly, personally, I just, kicking the can down the road, I just hope I'm dead when the shit really hits the fan, because I don't want to live through some C.S. MGTOW's excellent video on post-government societies. I don't want to live through anything like that.
Yeah, it would be terrible. It's just inevitable, though. That's the problem. Of these
well, I agree with you. It's inevitable, but I'm just hoping that it'll be at some point in time when I'm 6 feet under, as it were. So,
well, you could always fly over to the embrace of Jesus in the Midwest.
Yeah, well, we've talked about this a lot there. If I ever were to move back to the States, it would be either New Hampshire, Vermont, or Maine. I can't think of any other place I would move back to. So it wouldn't be the Midwest.
Those three states are very nice states. I mean, I've already shown my interest by talking about the libertarian movement in New Hampshire. So,
and you mentioned that in Maine, the governor's trying to get rid of the income tax.
Yes, he is currently trying to get rid of the income tax.
Yeah. I mean, all of those states, for those interested, very low crime. All of them have relatively low taxes. I mean, in New Hampshire is probably a champion. High rate of gun ownership, and they're just kind of peaceful places. And if you like New England, like I do, they're nice temperate climate as well.
Can't go wrong with that clam chowder.
Can't go wrong with the clam chowder or the lobster chowder or whatever.
Yes.
Clam chowder is more of a Massachusetts thing, which is pretty socialisty. It's doesn't really bear that much for them. New England's weird. I mean, Rhode Island and Massachusetts are much more left-leaning than. Although Vermont technically is left-leaning, it's not really left-leaning in the sort of the traditional sense that most left-leaning people would imagine. But it's something to consider if shit really, really hits the fan. Hungary is still an option there. After all, they did build a fence, and their welfare state kind of sucks.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, they probably didn't need to build the fence.
No, people argue with me, but I think Eastern Europe, for good reasons, good historical reasons, tend to be more xenophobic and hostile towards foreigners, whether it's Hungary or the Balkan states or Poland.
Well, they are bloody countries, so it can make sense.
1683, the halt of the advancement of the Ottomans in the Battle of Vienna, if I recall right. I mean, there's a history there, and sometimes that's just useful. That's a useful feature. But living in any Western European country is pretty depressing with the amount of welfarism and the tax requirements and all that. But I guess that's why I consider myself lucky having grown up, albeit in liberal New York, though I'm not a liberal myself, in the United States, because it gives you more perspectives. I imagine if I'd actually grown up in Europe, I'd probably be consumed with this idea that there's one system, and it's the welfare state and socialism, and that's the way a civilized society works, and the only way. That's unfortunate that I wasn't just exposed to that. If you actually talk to a European, though, it's you can't have a conversation like this. Most Europeans have been indoctrinated into the status system, and there's just no alternative for them. It's just fork over half your income. That's the best way. That's the best thing we can do. And the one that while I'm on the rant, when I see public services like the local subway system or whatever, when their prices go up, but I see no change in service actually to accommodate the price hike, it really just reminds me of how inefficient the government can be. And I'm sure you're familiar with the arguments. Well, who would run the trains and who would build the roads if the government didn't do it?
Man. The same people who build the roads right now, private contractors.
Yeah. I mean, usually when there's a price hike in the private sector, there's some concomitant increase or improvement.
Depending on whether or not it's a corporation or not, but
true. But I mean, I know from my personal experience where I live, be it the buses or the subway system, that I've seen the prices go up by practically €1 in the last 4 years or so, with absolutely no change in service. Still getting stuck in tunnels and getting delayed, and it's just, and you're just supposed to live with that, I guess. Insurance premiums going. I mean, all the usual bullshit. I know I sound kind of whingy, but I would just like, at least for people like us, to have some opportunity to live in a closer approximation. Without the government interference and everything, and the welfarism, just choice. I agree with you. I've told Coltrane this. If you want to live in, socialism paradise, by all means, but
don't make us pay for it.
Exactly. Just give us those of us who don't want to live in that situation more options, so we can live the lives we want, and you can live. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen, and we know the influence of the female vote, and I think people need to be realistic, especially Barbara also pointed this out eons ago, but libertarians who aren't sort of red pill or right-wing conservatives think they're going to shrink the government without infringing on women's quote-unquote right to vote, are living in a dreamland.
Yeah, they really are, and especially seeing as the quote-unquote modern libertarian movement having a party in and of itself is a sign that libertarian thought in the United States is pretty much dead on the vine. It's really tragic. It's just because it's a good strain of thought. It's at the very least, even if you don't agree with it, it's a different option from the red shirts versus the blue shirts, and which basically, who do you want to be the president of the United States? The guy backed by Goldman Sachs or the other guy backed by Goldman Sachs?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to, and that's why I don't vote, and I know that's why you don't vote. It doesn't do anything.
Yeah. There's more.
Although if you were pressed, let's say it came down to Hillary or Trump, let's say you absolutely had to choose, who would you vote for?
Oh gosh, that well, Clinton would be less likely to start a world war, but at the same time, Trump is the only candidate that has actually talked about the fact that Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm not sure if your audience is aware of this or not, but it's essentially this Asian countries, and there's a version of it that involves the United Kingdom as well. And he's the only one that's actually talked about the fact that, hey, you're essentially it's a really bad deal for a lot of Americans. It essentially allows for corporations to enforce their copyrights across national bounds. Like, for instance, with India, the vast majority of Indians can't afford American-priced pharmaceuticals for cancer, and so the Indian Supreme Court essentially said that there was no reason to legitimize. I believe it was Genentech, or I'm forgetting the name of the company that makes the cancer drug, but India essentially said no to the enforcement of drug patents in India, and so generics came in, and now the welfare of Indians has drastically improved because they can afford medication that they need. But the Trans-Pacific Partnership would effectively be an end to that, and so I don't know. I don't know who I'd choose. I would rather sit down, play video games, and just ignore the election. Just play The Witcher 3 for a while.
Witcher 3, which Adam I recommended originally. One of the best games I ever played.
I agree with that statement. Highly quality.
And you recently upgraded to the 980 Ti as well.
Oh, so. Yes. It makes everything wonderful to play with. Witcher 3, good game.
I'm enjoying that. Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of the basis, and we've gotten a sense that the Midwest is different from other places in the United States.
It has its own flavor.
And we've talked about it has its own flavor, Michigan venison. And we've talked about our own politics and how we wish we could live in a society with more choice and more freedom, and that's probably never going to happen. So keep on dreaming.
Yeah.
But yes, this is hopefully not the last time you've heard from Adam Jensen, because he does have a background in neuroscience, and he is well versed in genetics because he's a geneticist. So hopefully in the future, in the not too distant future, we're going to be covering some of those topics in depth. In particular, I'm seeking through his expertise to have sort of the definitive talk on the differences between male and female brains. A subject, of course, which has received a great deal of obfuscation in quote-unquote mainstream academia, and to the extent that differences are documented, they're sort of hidden, kept under wraps. And I think it's time that I, along with Adam's help, bring that to light so we can have an honest discussion about these things as opposed to the typical liberal cover-up. So
yeah, certainly.
Anyway, anything, Adam, you'd like to add as we draw to a close?
Other than the fact that I'm looking forward to the neuroscience talk, not at all.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've covered pretty much everything. As always, thanks for listening. By the way, for those who criticized the newscastery voice on my last video, I wasn't making fun of anyone. I was just changing it up, and I doubt I'll do that again. But who knows? I occasionally like to mix it up. So everyone, thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in, and I will catch you in all likelihood soon. And Adam Jensen will be back, fully augmented, to bring you some powerful science in the realm of the neurological. So everyone, thanks for listening. Take care, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you.